Welcome to MongoDB World and welcome to this session. This is going to be a 30-minute tutorial session with 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. I'll be around at the end with the microphone to facilitate any questions. But what you're all here for is this session by Pavel talking about passwordless authentication. So without any further ado, Pavel.
Woo. Hi, everyone. Hello. Pretty excited to be here at MongoDB World in person in New York. Really loving this 2019 vibes that we have here, and thank you all for coming to my talk about passwordless authentication. But before we dive into the problem, the solution, the code, the demo, and everything beyond it, I would like to tell you a few sentences about myself. So I'm based in Tel Aviv, and I've been working in the data engineering world for the last 18 years, starting as a DBA, moving to DevOps, being a data engineer, and I've been at MongoDB for the last 6 years, which is a long time for me. I'm now in developer relations, and I'm working with the most strategic accounts at MongoDB. And those strategic accounts, most of the time, inspire me to kind of think about solutions in different spaces. And that's how this talk was actually assembled, is thinking about for how long passwords existed and how long have we been using those websites with passwords. And the passwordless solution that are coming in right now is a much better solution. And I think that some people might be a bit scared of that or do not really know how to approach it. So I started digging in and I kind of assembled this nice demo and idea about passwordless authentication. And what better platform to use to build that than MongoDB and MongoDB Atlas and Atlas App Services. So let's focus on the problem first, right? The world got tired of passwords, but why? Why do we hate those passwords? We can divide it into two main sections, right? The user and the businesses, right? The users, obviously, we need to input and enroll the password, remember it, make sure that we're inserting a pretty strong password on one hand, but also remembering it across different applications. What do we end up doing? Using the same password or two passwords in most of our applications. And that's a bad thing, right? Because once one password is compromised, we might lose a lot of our accounts. In fact, did you know that every one of each 5 accounts in the US is being hijacked by either a password spoofing or password stealing? And obviously, how many of you, and you can raise your hand, in the last 6 months have forgot their password for some website and then needed to go through that pretty annoying process of getting the email, getting either it's a second factor or anything, and you wish you had a better solution. Businesses, obviously, need to first maintain those password-based database. They need to make sure that they comply with some of their password policies. They need to be sure that those passwords are secured. And what if they get breached, right? How impactful is it for a business to be known for a breach or for accounts being stolen? We already know. So that was a solid standard for a long time. And we did have added security measures to the passwords, right? We have the password authentication, and the 2FA credentials were added to make it stronger. Obviously, it is a stronger solution, right? You input your credentials, and then you get a piece of information to your device, either by a push or an SMS or a call. And obviously, this is much stronger because it's something that belongs to you, and it's a one-time thing. But this is also known to be tempered. And there's also, it's susceptible for the man in the middle. And there were cases where these things were broken as well, right? So what do I offer, right? So let's talk about WebAuthn and explore what WebAuthn is. So WebAuthn is a standard for web authentication that's been adopted by most of the web browsers that we use today. And by a standard, I mean that it is natively supported within the browsers, and it uses a browser-based API. So any web application can use this protocol, the WebAuthn protocol, and lots of the code that we need to implement in order to get the user consent from their device, and we'll talk what a consent is in a moment, is truly integrated into your web browsers, which makes it much easier and much better to develop with. This consent that can be our fingerprint, it can be a physical device that we have, or it can be our faces, will eventually be transferred to a private public key interaction. And we all know that cryptography was here for a long time, and it facilitates one of the strongest security measures that we have over the internet today. So why not use it for consent authentication? So the WebAuthn is built on top of private public key concepts, which makes it a very trustful process. And in the end, you actually transfer the power of authentication to the user hands, right? The user knows that they are providing those keys and this consent via a standard biometric that they use for logging into their laptops, logging into their tablets. And it makes development much easier because we don't need to maintain this email password overhead that we had before. Okay, so I talked about what it is theoretically, but let's break down how it actually works. So we need to think about two main processes that usually a user base needs to have, right? So the standard supports an enrollment flow and an authentication flow. There is one other important flow that I'm not going to talk during my presentation, but it's about recovery, right? Sometimes we need to have some processes of recovering an account if you cannot access it anymore. And if you have questions about it, we can talk about it later on. Okay, so what is the enrollment role? Obviously, is registering a device that we have with a user identifier to register to a website. The authentication is authenticating that device with the website that we have, right? Okay, let's talk about the enrollment flow. So think about the three main players that we have in this game, right? We have the authenticator, which can be our phone, our laptop, or even a physical device if we have some sort of a YubiKey. We have the web app, which is the hosted domain of our web code. And we obviously have a backend server, which will be used as an authentication server, right? When a user logs into the website and he goes into this registration page, you'll usually input some basic information like the username that we want to register. And this information is passed to the web server, right? When the authentication server, this web server, starts the enrollment phase, right, it generates a challenge. Think about a challenge as a session ID, okay? So this is used in order to make sure that whenever an enrollment starts by a specific device for a specific user, there's no other participant that can actually finish the enrollment until it is fully done. If the challenge key is invalidated, the whole process is basically invalidated and we need to start over. Once we generate this challenge, we actually take the user info and pass it back through our web app to the user, basically to the WebAuthn client. And one other thing is we are checking that the domain name that we're registering through is an allowed domain name. That eliminates a lot of website phishing and using false domains to kind of trick the user of registering to the correct website. Once we have this information, we can ask the user for his consent. And this is where the web browser actually kicks in and launches the UI or this box of what kind of methods we can input as our consent. Usually it would be either a fingerprint or a USB device, sometimes a Face ID, depending on what you're enrolled with the device. When this happens, we're using the cryptographic protocols to actually generate and send the public key, the signature signed by the private key of that public key, and a unique credential ID back to the server. The server stores this information, and it just sends back the same information to verify on the client side. Once this has happened, the challenge key that we first generated gets invalidated, and the user is considered enrolled. Now let's talk about the authentication flow. Remember, the same 3 players are involved. The user now goes into the login window, inputs the information that he used to enroll, which is basically our email or our user ID or username. We set up the same challenge once again for this process. And the user info that we have is also sent back to the device, and the domain name is tested against the authentication flow, that it also consists with the enrollment domain. Now, the device asks for the user consent for the authentication, so pops up, again, the dialog to input our fingerprint. And this thing actually generates the same signature we stored in the enrollment phase. And now what is left is just to compare that signature to the signature that we have on the web server. And once this happens, we can say the user is good to go. We can log in this user. All right. So what does MongoDB and application services have to do with all of this? And I would say many things, right? Obviously, each web server that stores information and needs to retrieve it needs a database. And since we're talking about web technology, it will be based on JSONs. And what a better database to store in JSON documents than in MongoDB. And think about the cloud opportunities in MongoDB Atlas. So you can start small and grow to a global application, right? So our user base can also probably start small, but as we grow, we can answer the demand of the user data that we're storing. We have the app services, single cloud backend, right? Obviously, using this with the app services authentication and linking that to app services authentication is a very compelling thing. And I will show you how I link the WebAuthn authentication with an actual Realm user using a Realm SDK just based on a function-auth, right? So we'll explore what function is in a minute. APIs, we have the data API, which I use in this presentation, and it's super cool because you don't need the drivers, and it was really, really easy to use one of the WebAuthn helper modules to set it up with the data APIs. If we want to do search, we have search capabilities. All those APIs allow us to integrate authentication very simply. We have cross-platform SDKs, right? So we can use those to actually not only use a web SDK, we can use an Android SDK, we can use an Apple SDK. We have a wide variety of SDKs that we can use and implement WebAuthn in them, right? And finally, we are super scalable. So once we authenticate, the user is going to probably generate data, interact with data. And since the database is scalable and the backend platform is scalable, that's a win-win, right? So let's think about the same kind of chart that we had before, But now let's see how MongoDB fits in, right? So the authenticator is obviously stays as is. The web app now is built out of React. We can use WebRealm SDK in that React application. And we have something called WebAuthn client, which is a helper function I use to prepare this demo. But if you don't like to work with a helper function, you can basically implement the WebAuthn protocol via the SDKs that they have. But I found it like really easy to work with Data API, so I use it, and I'll show you in a minute how it's being used. I've used Data API to connect my WebAuthn authentication server to Atlas. No need of drivers, just configuration-based, and you'll see it in a moment. And the nice thing is, once I have this data in the Atlas cluster, I can now link it to a Atlas App Service application and have a fully functioning user from the SDK, from the client SDK, and I can implement rules, I can implement serverless functions, I can run CRUD queries without the need of actually setting up a MongoDB client, which is really, really compelling, right? So let's think about the flow. What will happen? When the user log in into the login page, they would initiate a registration through the WebAuthn client. The WebAuthn client will send a request to the WebAuthn server. The WebAuthn server will generate the challenge and all the other information, and will use the Data API to store this information, right? Our authenticator will provide the consent, and once we generate all the signatures and the information, it will be automatically stored to Atlas through the Data API. And once we receive an OK for any of the operations, we can automatically link it to our App Services user and get a fully functioning client to have our CRUD operation, rule-based authentication, speaking directly with our app service, right? Okay, so that's all nice, but let's see how we do that, right? So first, we need to create an Atlas cluster, easy, few clicks, and we have an Atlas cluster. Your free tier cluster will be sufficient enough to test the demo. We enable the Data API, right? So it's also done by a few clicks. We enable the Data API on our dev cluster, and we have the Data API enabled. We just need to remember the URL endpoint and our API key. We create an App Services application, right? So we created, and the thing we need for now is just to note that the app ID, which is the namespace of that application. And finally, I've used WebAuthn helper function, which is an open source project. So I'm not really kind of advocating for it. It was really fun to use it, but you can use many WebAuthn clients to do that. Okay, let's code a bit, right? So remember the server authentication that I've explained about? So with this WebAuthn NPM module, I can set up all the endpoints by just providing a simple object to specify my endpoints. So first, I am initiating a WebAuthn object, and I'm mentioning what will be the field that will be used as our identifier. In my situation, I've used username as the identifier for a user. The origin is the domain that will be allowed to authenticate against that server. And this thing is taken from an environment variable. I can store some additional fields if I want for a user. For example, I want a display name to be different than the actual username. So I just have a username stored and a field called name. And finally, I just define the endpoints that will be automatically initialized to support registration, enrollment, registration, which is enrollment, the authentication, logout, And the most important part, and this is where I'll be a bit more, I'll spend a bit more time on, is the store section, right? But before we get to the store section, because I'm using Data API, what I've decided to do is do this generic function. Because my requests will be usually calling an Axios API call, right? So I've built a generic function that receives the method that I want to use. For example, is it a find, an update, an insert, and also the object that I want to run. For example, if it's a find, what's the filter? So instead of having this code being duplicated over and over, I have a generic function that just fires a Data API call. The store section in my WebAuthn object is really interesting because they let you implement the put, get, search, and delete operations to store your WebAuthn data in your database. And that's pretty cool because all you need to do is just implement those interfaces of getting an ID, for example, and retrieving a user, getting an ID and storing a user, searching for a user, right? So the way I've implemented put, for example, is using an object to facilitate what collection I'm going to write into, what will be the database, what will be the cluster name. And obviously, what I do eventually in a put operation is just do an upsert of that user storing its authenticators, right? So I received the authenticator values, and I've stored it inside my documents. And finally, I call this generic function that I built up front to kind of do an update one operation. The get, similar. I just use a find one operation, pretty convenient. The search one is doing a find, but it uses a regex to just, search for a value. It can use Atlas search if you use aggregation. That's a better solution than this, but I wanted to do something simple. And delete is obviously using a delete one. So once we implemented all of that endpoints, our WebAuthn server knows how to interact with our database. That's it. The only thing that is left to do is connect the endpoint of our WebAuthn object that we created to an Express server running at /WebAuthn. And we're good to go, or all of our data is initialized. Right? Let's move to the front end, right? This is the web application. So we'll probably have something like login.js in our React application to implement the login logic. And see here, I've imported the client from the same NPM, right? And since I'm using my localhost to run this, both the server and the client in that case, the client is initialized with an empty string, but you can define that there's a URL pointing to an external server, right? And somewhere in that code, I will have the onRegister function, and in that onRegister, kind of the only thing I need to do is call the WebAuthn client.register, pass it the information that we agreed with the server that we're gonna pass as our identifier. So it's the name, which is a display name, and the username, and wait for a response saying, okay, this thing was enrolled. And the interesting part is just this code will trigger the browser to ask for the consent and do the entire flow that we talked about in the enrollment flow. When we talk about the authentication flow, the front end will have something like onLogin function, right? And here, we need to do is call the login method and just provide it the username, right? And if the response from the WebAuthn server, once we provide the user consent and everything is okay, this user is good to go. But wait a second, we talked about adding Realm or app services into the picture. So how do we do that? So first, we need to enable function-auth. What function-auth does is it's an authentication method that will receive a login payload and will return a user based on a unique identifier. So as long as I'm returning the same identifier, I can link it to the same realm user. And the function is pretty straightforward. I just receive a specific username that tries to authenticate, and I go to my Atlas cluster via the context services get, the Atlas cluster and everything, and I just locate that user and I return its credential ID. This credential ID is unique for each user. This way, it will always return the same user. So if we look at the code now, what we need to add is first initialize our Realm app pointing to our App Services application ID. And then we'll need to do kind of a login custom function. So this custom function actually receives the user ID and transfers it to Realm. So when we look at the code of the login before, right, it only had WebAuthn.login with the username. But now, if the response is okay, we will call the function login, which will not require any input from the user, but it will automatically link it to the correct user based on the database. And once we get that, we can set it in our state, and we'll have a full functioning user object to work with from now on. So in this example, in the user.js, which in my example is just the UI after I log in, I can show the realm ID of that user, meaning that I can access a real realm object. Even though I performed the authentication with WebAuthn, the function-auth links me to a valid realm user. All right, let's do a quick demo. So on the register side, I'm inputting my username, right? It's gonna be Pavel.Dukovny, and my display name will be Pavel, right? I'm clicking the register button. What will happen now is the request will pop up this UI asking for my Mac fingerprint. Once I provide it, I'm registered. I can now use the same username to log in into the application, and the same pop-up will pop again. And I'm just providing my fingerprint, and that's it. I'm logged in. I've just printed out the information that I got from the server, and I have my Realm ID as well, so I have a Realm functioning client, right? If we go to the Atlas side, right? Remember this collection that we were using? It actually has data now, right? Because we enrolled the user, we saved the information that we talked about before, and we have a user in our database. On the Realm side, we also performed this authentication with a function, right? And I just printed out the information that I got. So we already got a valid user from our App Services application. You want to play it again? Should I play it again? Just if somebody, let's play it again quickly. Right, so my flow is registering a user by providing a username and a display name. And the login will fire all the needed kind of like parts to pop up this, please give me your biometric consent. Right? So in this case, I'm using my fingerprint, but if I have other other consents enrolled, yeah, I can use them. Yeah, so thank you. I have a GitHub repo ready for you to explore. You can take a picture, you can scan the QR code. You can come closer and scan. I'll leave this slide open for now so you can get it. And there's this simple sample application that I just showed. All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Pavel. So now we have some time for Q&A. I have a mic. I'll bring it around for anyone that has questions, and we can go in order of people that I see.
How do you then log in on another device?
How do you log in on another device?
Yeah, like you're logged in on your laptop now. Now, what if you want to log into the same app on your phone?
Yeah. So my implementation was pretty naive, right? I have just one authentication, but since MongoDB allows us to store arrays, right? We can basically push the user with WebAuthn, you'll probably need to enroll with every device that you're using. So if you change the device, you'll need to enroll it. But once you store it in an array and you fetch by this array with your function authentication, you can return, for example, the user ID or the underscore ID of that document, and it will always link to the same realm user, for example. So basically, having an array instead of implementing it via just an embedded object.
Cool. Question up front.
So I noticed that in the custom function that you're using to authenticate the user, it's just you're passing in a username and it's doing a find one for that user. Now, say someone just happened to get your Realm app ID and then they called the custom authentication method just passing a username. Wouldn't they be able to just authenticate to that user because there's no actual point of authentication in the function itself?
So what are you saying? You're saying that if somebody knows your username and they know your Realm ID.
You're like
Yeah, but my function is private, right?
No, so if let's say you're using the Realm SDK and you use the custom function login method, that login method will directly call that custom function or that custom authentication function, even though it is private.
So first of all, in Realm, you can actually only restrict it to specific domains or IPs. So you can only allow your web app server to to perform the authentication. So somebody will need to hack into your web app server and then run this, right? Sorry? The web SDK is running on...
Yeah, let's say you're running it just from like a client web application. So like I have a web application that I'm using for the user to authenticate, and then someone else just sets up an instance with the Realm SDK or Realm Web SDK. They happen to know what my Realm app ID is, and then they just, using the Realm app ID, use the custom function authentication method, pass a username that they know of someone else.
Yeah, but I think you can restrict what clients are connecting to your Realm. So the web server is hosted on a server, sorry, right? So I can allow only that server. But you're saying that this code runs on the client?
Yeah, so just anyone, you go to your website, whatever the website is, and that's any user goes on their own computer to their own browser to that site to authenticate.
But how do they pass the WebAuth and authentication?
I'm saying they wouldn't have to. I'm concerned with, I'm just wondering at that point, because in the custom function itself, there's no authentication check there. It's just I'm thinking a user could directly call that custom function method with just that find one operation and be able to successfully log in. Now, if that WebAuthn functionality was in the function, it's in that custom function itself, then that's where the blocker point would be that could throw that error to prevent the user from getting in.
But your client code also have this WebAuthn code that only once you pass this code, it will send the login. You're saying that you're kind of like recoding the app?
Yeah, exactly. If I'm some hacker, I decide to recode the app, and because I know your Realm app ID, I know someone else's username, I could just call the custom function method passing that username.
Yeah, I'll need to think about how can you secure that. But first of all, how do they know your web, your Realm ID?
I don't know. I mean, if let's say in an env file. Those aren't always the most encrypted. It's
No, but usually you'll use kind of like a hosting facility that will, use an env file on the. For example, I use Vercel, right? You cannot like get a Vercel secret. That
yeah,
easy.
of course, it's not the easiest thing, but I'm just saying in the case that someone did come across something like that.
All right, so I'll need to think about it. I think you should be able to restrict it in a way. Maybe the query shouldn't be that naive. Like maybe you should have like some sort of another authentication.
I know if you put the WebAuthn stuff in, or some form of check in the custom function itself, regardless of the user that calls that function.
Yeah, but this function has no interaction with the you need to request something from the user device, right? So the function will be only triggered after you got this. If you put the logic of triggering, then on your client side, what are you going to do? Okay, we can chat about it later. But yeah, thanks for bringing up this point.
Anyone else have any questions? Oh, we have two. I think I saw your hand first.
Okay, so I totally see why you want to have that Realm user login to use all the advantages of Realm, of course. Is there any experiences on how many users you can have on your cluster with like Realm users? Like if you have like a large data set of like millions of users, is there any experiences with that?
Well, I know that I saw applications with thousands of users and 10,000s of users, but usually what you'll end up doing is not having just a single web app services application. You might have several like app services applications if you have like different modules. But if you can actually transfer, I think you can transfer users between applications.
Okay.
Yeah, I know that there's applications with tens, thousands of users, sometimes hundreds of thousands of users. So that's something that is built for scale. Yeah. So obviously, the same way that you will use Realm with username password, if you have a functional authentication, it's the same kind of story.
Of course.
Yeah. So it's not like a database user, right? It's like a backend service user.
Oh, okay. But if I want to like access the Realm from a mobile device, I probably need to use it as like a front-end user account, right? Or is there another way of authenticating to?
Yeah, so it's a front-end user.
Okay.
The thing that is created.
But there's no way to like skip the app services users by like plugging in Auth0 or any other authentication provider to use Realm, right? Like for Realm, you have to stick to the Realm users thing, right?
Yeah, but there's different providers that you can link to a Realm user. There's like Google, Apple. Here I saw like I just shown like function-auth.
Okay,
So
but
you can use JWT and Auth0, yeah.
But there will still be like a Realm user created with every user you create in JWT or other authentication providers.
You can link users together. We have like a link identities.
Okay.
So you can link them and that will result as a single identity.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
I think we had one question over here.
You're walking a lot.
Yeah.
What other authentication mechanism can we use? Like you mentioned the Mac thing. Can we also club with Google Authenticator or something else?
With Google Authenticator?
Mm-hmm.
I think like what I saw is there's I think there's the YubiKeys. I think Google Authentic. Yeah, so I guess that there's it needs to be a physical device. It cannot be like just an application, right? Because it needs to be either a fingerprint. It needs to be a consent that is essentially what the WebAuthn expects is this private public key set that is generated from whether it's your fingerprint or like any other terms of consent that you can provide through a device.
Great, thank you.